Well, shall we gather back, everyone? We do have a congregational meeting today after the second service. It'll be about a 20-minute meeting, and we'd love for you to come back. Are we able to tune in online for that? I don't know. I just thought of it in the moment. So maybe you'll be able to tune in online if you're not able to come back. It's really a pleasure to be able to introduce Andy Patton to you. Andy and his wife Lindsay met at Mizzou, so they're part of us here in Missouri. And Andy and his family have been serving in British L'Abri for the last many years. L'Abri is a wonderful concept that Francis and Edith Schaefer began years ago, which is basically a home. And whatever question you have about life and God, you can go there and pursue that question in a hospitable, judgment-free zone, an invitation to look earnestly at the questions of life. And Andy and Lindsay have been living with people, doing that for many years. They've just moved back to the States, and he's serving as Director of Operations for the Rabbit Room. I highly commend the Rabbit Room. You could look it up online. It's a marvelous community for artists who are wanting to explore their artistry, as well as to see how their artistry and God connect. And so the Rabbit Room, please check that out. And a particular privilege Jessica and I had yesterday speaking for a Francis Schaeffer Institute conference, to be able to partner with Andy there and to hear his heart and what he's going to share with us today, his heart for those who are deconstructing their faith. And just about all of us here are either doing that in this community or we know someone who is. And the heart that Andy has is to be a hospitable, compassionate, listening friend for those who are deconstructing their faith, a knowledgeable friend as well, and also to be of help to those who are trying to love their loved ones who are deconstructing their faith and makes us feel afraid and things like that. And so with that kind of heart and background, it seems like Riverside's just makes a lot of sense for Andy to come and speak to us. So Andy, I'm privileged to welcome you to share with us today.
Morning. All right. So we're going to be looking at a passage from 2 Corinthians today. And it is about a problem Christian people have, church people, religious people. And we believe in a lot of things that you can't see. And we think that those things are important things, important enough to kind of be a center around which your life should move. It should affect things. But the catch is you can't see them. And that's the problem. So Paul will be looking at some of his words, especially the phrase, we walk by faith and not by sight. So let me just read this passage we're going to be looking at this morning, and then I'll tell a bunch of stories, mostly about L'Abri. So in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul writes, we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. If indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are in this tent we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. And then he just adds this little phrase, for we walk by faith and not by sight. So before I dive in, I just want to give a little snapshot of what Corinth was like. So Paul was raised as a Jew, went to the Harvard of Jewishness, kind of. He was a rising star in the Jewish community, and he was very zealous, so zealous that he wanted to kill members of this upstart sect, talking about Jesus. And he was going to do that, and then he had this experience. He was walking by sight, and on the road to Damascus, he he saw this light, and he heard from God. So that changed his life, and then he spent the rest of his days wandering around telling about the message of Jesus. And one of the places that he went to was a city in the Roman Empire called Corinth. And Corinth was a bit of a wild place. It was sort of like Vegas. There was a temple. This is digging way back in my seminary days here. I didn't plan on saying this. There's a temple of Aphrodite at the top of a mountain, and the women who worked there were temple prostitutes. And they'd walk down, and there on the bottom of their sandals, carved in reverse, were the words "Follow me." And so they would leave footprints that said "Follow me," so you could see the footprints and find what waited for you at the end of the trail. Paul's time in Corinth was not peaceful, but it was very fruitful. It was very dangerous. It was becoming a Christian in the Greco-Roman context in Corinth in those days was not a light thing, not a thing to be undertaken lightly. You could face violence. You're entering into a community that is a minority and an opposed minority from the Romans, from whom the Christians were very different, and from the Jews, from whom the Christians were kind of growing out of and having a lot of tension with. So that's just the context of Corinth. So when Paul's in this, we're not focusing on the things Paul is saying here, but he's saying basically, if you die, God will give you another house. So he's another body, and this is and Paul had a very embattled relationship with the people who were in and out of his fruitful ministry. So he spent a lot of time there and would go away. And the Bible includes these 2 letters he wrote back to Corinth. And he's giving them advice and he's giving them encouragement. So there's a lot of banned ideas here, even in these few sentences. Ideas that are dismissed by the modern world, and maybe even some of you think, well, this is why Christianity is ridiculous. Paul's assuming that there is a world we can see and a world we can't see. There's an aspect to this world that is invisible. He's talking about our earthly home. He's talking about something eternal in the heavens, and he's assuming God. Like, if this earthly tent we live in is destroyed, he's using a tent metaphor. He was a tent maker. God will give us a house not built by human hands. So the part that I want to focus on for the rest of the sermon is that last little phrase, for we walk by faith and not by sight. This is getting back to the problem religious people have. So we believe in an invisible world, and faith means something like living as though that invisible world is part of what is real. But these days, walking by sight has never been easier. And I'll get into a bit of what I mean by that. But I just want to open us up with a question. I'm going to pause everything I've just been saying, put a question to you. And notice the answers that come to mind. When was your last encounter with God? Just think about that for a second. When was your last encounter with God? Have you had an encounter with God? Have you had one this year? Have you had one this month? Have you had one this morning? What do you think? Notice what comes to mind. I was reading a Christian newspaper, and I saw a headline. I don't usually read this newspaper. I was building a fire with the newspaper, actually, and I thought, wow, I better read that article. Something about an encounter with God. And I was thinking about questions along these lines, and I came across this quote, and I thought, I've got to keep that. I've got to save that. So the quote was a missionary telling the story about how he became a Christian. Here's the quote. When I was young, I had a supernatural encounter with God. Nobody had shared the gospel, neither had I read the Bible or a gospel tract. Instead, I heard a voice leading me to go to church. The thing I really appreciate about this quote is that this person clearly believes that God is real and is able to act in the world. But it didn't catch my attention because I think it is a great example of what I'm going to be talking about. Actually, I think it's cut from the same cloth as the thing I'm going to be critiquing a bit this morning. So let's unpack a few things about the perspective behind what that man was saying. What's supernatural about the experience he's relating? He says, when I was young, I had a supernatural encounter with God. One aspect seems to be he had an experience of God that was unexplainable by any natural means, he says. Nobody shared the gospel with me. I hadn't been reading the Bible. It was associated with something invisible. He heard a voice. And it was supernatural because he wasn't reading the Bible or a tract, he says. So I read that and I thought, if he had been reading the Bible, would it be less supernatural? What if he had been watching a movie or taking a shower? What if someone who loved him sat him down and said, you need to go to church? Would that have been less of a supernatural encounter with God? When most people think of the supernatural, they think about things that happen beyond the bounds of what we call normal reality. But isn't God part of normal reality, normal everyday experience? The Bible seems to be full of little indications that that's the case. The lilies that grow, the sparrows that fall. If that was not the case, why pray about our everyday experiences? Let me tell you a little bit about L'Abri. Zach mentioned L'Abri. It's an organization that was started by Francis and Edith Schaeffer back in the 50s. So they were missionaries, and they felt called to leave. Francis was kind of a rising star in the Christian world of his day, and he felt called to leave all that, move to a house in Switzerland on a hillside, and start opening their home to whoever God would bring. And they called that L'Abri, which means shelter in French. So that work didn't go away. It spread over the past. It's about 70 years old now, and there's 8 or 9 branches all over the world. So my wife and I spent 7 years at the English branch as of last year. So we're coming back home. Francis, before that happened, deconstructed his spirituality. He had a spiritual crisis. And a lot of it was due to the things he was seeing in the lives and relationships of Christian people. And he thought, hang on, I read all these things in the Bible, and then I have these conflicts with fellow church people, or I go into church meetings, and it's like we're making all these decisions as though none of that other stuff is true. It's all just practicality. And it was very disillusioning for him. To the point where he just said, to be consistent, I need to walk away from this, and I need to start again from square one. So he did that, and it was terribly destabilizing for his wife, Edith. Out of that time came L'Abri, and came another book, came a book called True Spirituality. And it was in the crucible of that spiritual crisis, Francis came to believe again that all this is true. That is the case. It is also the case that I have to change my whole life. The way I've learned how to do this is something is foundationally wrong with it. So the book True Spirituality captures some of what he meant by that. I say that because I'm going to be quoting from True Spirituality from here on out. So that's the ride you signed up for when you came in the doors today. Here's what one of the things Francis says about our topic. He writes, "Our generation is overwhelmingly naturalistic." This is from True Spirituality. "There's an almost complete commitment to the concept of the uniformity of natural causes in a closed system. We're going to revisit that and unpack it a little bit. If we are not careful, even though we say we are biblical Christians and supernaturalists, nevertheless, the naturalism of our generation tends to come in upon us, like a fog creeping in through the window, opened only half an inch. As soon as this happens, Christians begin to lose the reality of their Christian lives. So he's speaking from spiritual experience there, personal experience of what happened to his life and his faith. So let's revisit a few things about this quote. He says, the uniformity of natural causes in a closed system. That is a very wordy way to say what he's saying. And all he means by that is that these days, you don't need to resort to explanations of divine activity to account for everything in the universe. The sequence of cause and effect all the way back to the beginning is closed. Divinities need not apply. We don't need gods to explain anything anymore. We have science. We've used the powers of our minds to figure all that stuff out. So this is, he calls naturalism. He goes on to say, the naturalism of our generation tends to come in upon us. So he's speaking as a Christian person, and he's just been through this whole spiritual crisis in which that was the conclusion that he came to. This naturalism, I don't really believe, snuck in to my life and practice. And to the degree that that happens, he says, Christians begin to lose reality. Reality in his mind means an agreement between what I say I believe and what is visible in my life. Reality. This isn't just an idea, it's a reality. So if all this is true, coming back to us in this room, what might it look like to walk by faith today? Coming back to Paul's little aside. We walk by faith and not by sight. What might that look like? I always think about I have a friend, Liz, who started a company in Africa, and then she brought a friend of hers from Uganda back to America, and they took a trip to a grocery store. And it was a normal trip to the grocery store. You get your cart, you fill it with all the things that you might need in that week, and trade money for those things, and then throw it all in the trunk and go home. And the woman from rural Uganda said, as they were walking to the car from across the parking lot, she said, "Why do you pray?" Just confronted Liz with this. She was stunned at the experience she just had. Why do you pray? Because they had just piled into the cart so many of the things that this woman had grown up needing God to provide and praying for. But, we can just snap our fingers. We can have that whenever we want. So the modern world has created efficient systems for giving us all the things, so many of the things we need, not all of the things. And many of those are things that were prayed for throughout human history. Think about food, as in the story, or health. I had a headache last night that was keeping me awake, and I got up and I took 2 ibuprofen, and the headache went away. It was wonderful. And then my kids came in at 6 a.m., and that was not wonderful. Shelter in Nashville right now. Nashville is experiencing a huge boom. That's where I live. It's like they're just inflating houses. It's amazing. It's transforming. Comfort. Modernity can give us children, whereas so many stories in the Bible are people just praying for children. Security, protection, prosperity. The modern world has given us unprecedented amounts of all of those things on tap. If you need something, you can just open up your Amazon app on your smartphone, and they have that Buy Now button, and it is addictive. You can just have a need, click. It'll be there tomorrow. The world's goods are at our fingertips, which is why it's called Amazon. The Amazon is the world's largest river, and Jeff Bezos wanted it to be that, a river of all goods. One store to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. If you want to know something, you can Google it. If you want to meet someone, there's apps for that too. You can go meet someone. So modernity has given us all these problems and all these solutions to its own problems. It's the genie's bargain from Aladdin. Phenomenal cosmic powers, but itty-bitty living space. All this power has had consequences for what it means to flourish as a human and and if you're a Christian in this room today, what it means to walk by faith and not by sight. It's harder. Maybe this is just the fact that this is the world I grew up in rather than 1022. Maybe someone from back then would say it was pretty hard back then too. But I'm looking at all these things and saying, wow, everything's so much more powerful now. Everything is so much more easy now. It has an effect on that spot, that intersection of our ideas about reality and about God and our practice. And it's easier to live as though God doesn't exist. It's easier to live as though God doesn't exist. My friend's Ugandan friend was saying, you don't need to walk by faith. You can walk by sight. Why do you pray? You have everything you need right here. And it's a fair question. It should be a challenging question. If you are a person that believes the God of the Bible is real, can you account for every aspect of your daily life on a wholly materialistic level? A closed sequence of cause and effect, to go back to Schaeffer's words. How would your life be different if it turned out deism was true, that God just kind of wound up the world like a watch and then stepped back to set it ticking? Would it make any difference? Should it make any difference? So let's come back to Paul's words in 2 Corinthians. He's not so much teaching the supernatural frame of the world so much as assuming it. He's saying, you are endangered, you face many threats, and here is some encouragement. Even if you die, that is not the end of existence. And take courage, we walk by faith, not by sight. So I'm wondering if we need to do a bit of theology, which some of you will be excited by, some of you will be turned off by. If you're in the latter group, it will be short. Coming back to Schaeffer, here's another quote from True Spirituality. According to the biblical view, there are two parts to reality: the natural world, that which we see normally, and the supernatural part. When we use the word supernatural, however, we must be careful. The supernatural, and he puts it in quotes, is really no more unusual in the universe from the biblical viewpoint than what we normally call natural. The only reason we call it supernatural is that we usually can't see it. So he's saying, actually, it's a trick of perspective, and it's a bit of a misnomer. There are two parts to reality, Schaeffer is saying. One is we can see, and one we can't see. The visible realm and the invisible realm. And he would often remind people, he'd hold up his hand and say, the supernatural is here. The supernatural is here. It's not off away in some other place somewhere. So using the word supernatural it's a bit of a misnomer because we have this association of distance and abnormality. And Schaeffer is challenging that. He's saying it's here. We can't see the far side of the moon, but we believe that it exists. The same is the case with the quote-unquote supernatural realm. And I think the Bible also tells that story about the things we can't see. So think about Paul. Paul later, after the Corinth stuff, goes to Athens, and he's addressing a group of Athenian philosophers. And he's describing God to them, and he's looking for places where they agree. And my picture of God and your picture of God agree. He's saying, in him, as some of your own poets have said, and then he quotes one of their poets, in him we live and move and have our being. That in God, Paul's trying to persuade these pagans, we live and move and have our being. That's pretty near. It's almost like God is to us as water is to fish. We move in him. We have our being in him. Or think even about Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That isn't only talking about the sky and the ground. If you look at that word heavens, it applies to three things: where the birds are, where the stars are, and God's space. There's a 1, 2, 3. There's a kind of a third understanding of a third heaven. So that there is the visible, and the invisible, two realms, but one whole. So the Bible tells the story of a unity of heaven and earth in creation. Think back to page 1 and 2 of Genesis. There is this open exchange between these two characters, Adam and Eve, and God talks to them, walks with them. They have this interaction. It's almost as if these two realms are more easily interpenetrated. But that doesn't last. It doesn't last very long. Something goes wrong, and there is a sundering. And in Genesis 3, that is pictured as an exile. This is the place where we walked with the Lord in the cool of the day, and you have lost access to it. But throughout the Bible, the invisible realm is breaking through into the visible realm over and over again, and breaking through and creating these spaces that are supposed to ooze out into the visible realm, where different rules hold. It's a different kingdom. And the Old Testament is a story of God breaking through and then that place eventually being overturned. But the union of those two realms, and theology is almost over, so just buckle up for a little bit longer. Those two, the invisible and the invisible, are most fully joined in Jesus. So in Jesus, God himself breaks through into the visible world in the form of a baby. And then he grows up, and then everywhere around him, things start to go right. The fall, the separateness that the world has been laboring under is reversed. So he teaches, he corrects people's ideas. He heals their bodies. There are moments that we call miracles. He changes water into wine so that the party at a wedding feast can continue. So that Jesus is the most fully realized unity, undoing of the thing that happened in Genesis 3. And the story the Bible tells, and the message that Paul is also telling throughout his ministry, is that it didn't end there, and actually you are now to be the next iteration of the unity between heaven and earth. So that the things that happen around Jesus are to happen around us. That is one of the shocking claims of the New Testament. Theology ended. What are we supposed to do with that? Does that mean, does walking by faith and not by sight, as we try to take seriously the picture of reality that the Bible's laying out for us, does that mean that we get to change water into wine too, or walk on top of it? That does not often happen, and you probably shouldn't give it a try. But that doesn't mean the answer is just no. So what is the shape of this calling to walk by faith in the human life, day to day, moment by moment? There's a long conversation we could have about this, but I just want to say two things. One thing about prayer. What is the role of prayer in all of this? And another thing about the ordinariness of what it means to walk by faith. First, last quote from True Spirituality. Francis Schaeffer writes in this slim and wonderful little book, "To be a true Bible-believing Christian, we must understand that it is not enough to simply acknowledge that the universe has two halves." So everything that I've just said, if you're thinking, that sounds pretty good, Schaeffer is saying, good. And that is also not enough. It's not enough to only acknowledge that the universe has two halves. The Christian life means living into the two halves of reality, the supernatural and the natural parts. I would suggest that it is perfectly possible for a Christian to be so infiltrated by 20th century thinking that he lives most of his life as though the supernatural were not there. Indeed, I would suggest that all of us do that to some extent. Being a biblical Christian means living in the supernatural now, not only theoretically, but in practice. So that is this great challenge, and one of the main things he's trying to address in this book, True Spirituality. If what he's describing is not true spirituality, what is true spirituality? So the two things I want to leave you with as we come to the end one about prayer, one about ordinariness. So the first part, there is no formula for how to walk by faith. And there's no formula for how to pray, because God is a person, and we are persons. So there's a wildness to that. And God is different to different people at different times, according to what we need and according to his freedom. However, that doesn't mean there is not something to say about this. And when it comes to prayer, I think there's not a template, there's not a formula, but there is a sequence. And the sequence consists of 3 steps. And this is all, I'm kind of showing my L'Abri cards. L'Abri has been very influential and formative for me. This is L'Abri stuff. Pray, wait, and act. That's the sequence, a 3-step sequence. Pray, wait, and act. What does it mean to walk by faith and not by sight? Here's a quick story. So this is about Edith Schaefer, Francis Schaeffer's wife, and a friend of mine, Dawn. Dawn worked at, I'm going to have a little backstory here. Hopefully I don't lose you. Dawn worked at the English L'Abri when I was there. Dear friend. She was in her 40s. When Dawn was a kid, when she was in her late teens, Dawn was the caretaker for Edith Schaefer at the end of Edith's life. So they were very close, and Dawn helped her do things. Edith she was often asked to come teach and lecture places. So one morning, Edith was going somewhere, going to share the gospel with maybe hundreds of people, and they got into the car, and the car wouldn't start. And Dawn pulled out her phone to call a taxi, and Edith stopped her. She put her hand on Dawn's hand and said, "Don't call a taxi. Let's pray." So they prayed. That was how Edith lived her life. She was quite a prayerer of prayers. She really believed it. And there are so many stories of just things happening around. When Edith prayed, things would kind of happen. She left gaps in that naturalistic chain of cause and effect, gaps unexplainable if God did not exist. And that was actually the motivation behind L'Abri. If this is true, let us demonstrate its reality in the way we live our life. So when Edith put her hand on Dawn's hand and stopped her from calling the taxi, she was trying to walk by faith and not only by sight. She was saying, I will leave a gap in the chain of cause and effect that will be unexplainable except if God exists. So Dawn was telling me this story, and that's kind of the nice and spiritual sounding part. And I said, "So what happened next?" And Dawn said, "Oh, we called a taxi." And that is an important part of the story too. And that's why I chose this story for this message. There are lots of stories where Edith would pray about something, and then somebody would show up, and they would give their lives to Christ, and then these miraculous stories. This is also a supernatural story. That's part of what I'm saying. That leaving that gap, pray, wait, and act, is Edith being a supernatural creature in God's reality. Someone who is saying, I am God's creature, and I don't know God's plan for me today. And maybe that plan could have been someone comes along with a problem and a car and gives them a ride, and something more beautiful and wondrous happens than simply using a taxi to get to this place. But that's not what happened. But they called a taxi, and that's an important part of the story, because the third step in that process, pray, wait, and act, is to act. It's not just more spiritual not to act. Walking by faith doesn't necessarily mean that. The waiting is important, and the acting is important. Sometimes the sequence ends in the waiting. You pray and you wait, and something happens. Something unexpected and unexplainable fills that gap. Sometimes you're praying and waiting for something, and the thing that comes is a no, and that is important. because God is a person, and God is free, and He knows what we need. But sometimes you have to act, and sometimes the time to act comes before you feel the waiting is finished. So you have to move forward with uncertainty, and that means in this walking by faith, there will be a lot of mistakes and a lot of uncertainty. Walking by sight is it has different benefits. There's certainty. Walking by faith involves mistakes and uncertainty. And that is part of what it means to be God's creature. So that's the first thing I wanted to say about prayer. Just one more thing. When we use phrases like supernatural living, the danger is we import all these ideas about what a miracle is and what it means to live with power. And I want to just address that. It doesn't mean you're going to hear an invisible voice telling you to go to church, like the quote that I started with in the newspaper that I then burned. You may not and should not necessarily expect your normal experience to be one of what people would call miraculous, although that you also should expect the possibility of that. Both of those two things are true. If you shelter under a tree in a rainstorm, you're having a supernatural experience. You are interacting with a piece of God's creation that is actively being sustained by Him, and the meanings of that tree extend far beyond your ability to even understand in time and place. How much more when you're getting your groceries and standing before the person at the checkout counter? How much more of a spiritual experience is that? Because you're standing before someone who bears the image of God. So when I ask that somewhat cheeky question, when was your last supernatural encounter with God? I'm trying to really take the bar right down. We are having one right now. So walking by faith doesn't have to be radical. It doesn't have to be something people would be amazed by, unless they're paying attention. It's loving your neighbors. That can take supernatural faith. Your actual neighbors. It means getting involved in the time and place that God has put you in. The Bible tells us that God has plans for us, and stepping into those plans in the reality of what they are, the time and place, your workplace, your family, your neighborhood, that is a walking by faith, being open to people. In the talkative 10 minutes, that is a moment that is often fraught with peril for introverts. That can be a very spiritual moment. I'm God's creature. I don't know what His plans are for me today. Being hospitable to change and interruptions. I didn't expect this car not to start, but we're not going to automatically call a taxi. We're going to wait for a while. It means doing the colossal and self-denying work of loving your enemies. And that can be a supernatural act, especially when your neighbors and your enemies are the same people. It means doing the hard work of forgiving that we all find we have to do. That is what it means to walk by faith also. It means giving people your complete attention, even when you're tired or the things that they are saying are so inane or problematic, because that is what Jesus did. Jesus, the most perfect union of heaven and earth, the most complete human, had a lot of time for people. And it was because He was God, not despite He was God. It means committing yourself to the truth even when it's costly. That's also walking by faith. And it means structuring your life in such a way that there are gaps in that naturalistic chain of cause and effect that should be puzzling. I often thought of the analogy of the thing that L'Abri is trying to do in the way it's structured its life can be pictured by the analogy of a ladder against an invisible wall. So you have a visible ladder, invisible wall, it's really there, you can't see it. What Schaeffer's saying is the Christian life is leaning the ladder against the invisible wall and climbing the ladder, so that when people see it, it's very puzzling. But to live in such a way that You're walking by faith demonstrates the reality of God, and not only in the things that we would call miraculous, but in the ordinary and everyday. Can I pray for us? Lord, thank you that you are here and that you are good to us and that you have been rich in mercy and that you can you're committed enough to slowly walk us into your reality and what it means to live as though you're real. And I pray that you would meet with us again and lead us further into that. Amen.
If you're able, why don't you stand with me as we close? There is an endless song echoes in my soul. I hear the music ring, and though the storms may come, I am holding on to the rock I cling. How can I keep from singing your praise? How can I ever say enough? How amazing is your love? How can I keep from shouting your name? I know I'm loved by the King, and it makes my heart want to sing. I will lift my eyes in the darkest night, for I know my Savior lives, and I will walk with you, knowing you'll see me through and sing the songs you give. How can I keep from singing your praise? How can I ever say enough? How amazing is your love? How can I keep from shouting your name? I know I'm loved by the King, and it makes my heart want to sing. I can sing in the troubled times, sing when I win. I can sing when I lose my step and fall down again. I can sing 'cause you pick me up, sing 'cause you're there. I can sing 'cause you hear me, Lord, when I call to you in prayer. I can sing with my last breath, sing, for I know that I'll sing with the angels and the saints around the throne. So how can I keep from singing your praise? How can I ever say enough? How amazing is your love? How can I keep from shouting your name? I know I'm loved by the King, and it makes my heart. I know I'm loved by the King, and it makes my heart. I know I'm loved by the King,
Thanks so much, Andy. Andy will be with us here after the service. If you have questions that you want to follow up with him about what he was saying, he'd welcome that. Please feel free to do that. And please tune back in around noon or come back and join us for our congregational meeting. And we'll be giving some updates. And meanwhile, I'm thinking about the early follower of Jesus that Andy mentioned. His name was Paul. And as Paul meditated on the love of Christ and then he remembered all the wreckage he himself had been and had caused, he just began to say this, and I get to say it to you. He said, "There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Go in peace. Amen."